We've done this podcast for like 119 episodes, and this story you're telling, it just sounds like very familiar.
All right, I could make healthier relationship choices.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne.
I'm Noah.
Did you know there's a rabbi here?
No shit.
Yeah.
Where?
He has a beard, and he was definitely judging me.
Sounds like a rabbi.
I'm really excited to share this conversation that I had with Rabbi Gary Mazo. Gary's been a friend of mine for a little over a decade. We talk about where we first met, some of the different interfaith projects that we've been a part of in our community of Evansville over the last decade plus. We go all the way back to when he decided to become a rabbi. Very challenging situation that he faced in his first congregation that he was hired into. We talk about the changes in the dynamics of online community and how it's affected his congregation, as well as even political challenges over the last several years and how he's had to play both a role for his community and then in the larger community as a representative of the Jewish faith in interfaith matters. I really think you'll like it and appreciate it. We get into some good places, but there's actually even more that we could cover here in the future. So I'm hoping this might be the first of a series of congregations with my friend, the rabbi, the teacher, Gary Mazo. Right. Gary Mazo, my friend, do you remember when we first met? When and where? I've got a memory of it. I'm wondering if we have the same memory.
Share yours. I'm not sure.
Okay. So what I remember is we were at the University of Evansville, and there was like some sort of like emergency interfaith situation.
Yes, now I do.
Okay.
And I remember exactly what that was.
Okay. Was it the 8-foot-tall crosses on
the
Riverside
riverfront.
Drive?
Yep.
Okay. So I remember you were, okay, so this is where you can help fill in the memory. How long had you been in the community and in this role at that time?
Month
Yeah.
and a half, right? So, yeah.
You take the job and you're getting a lay of the land, and all of a sudden the interfaith bat signal goes up and you respond to the call.
And I think that was important, right? Because what I realized then, and obviously much more now, we're the only synagogue, we're the only Jewish institution for 100 miles in any direction, right? So when something comes up that needs some kind of perspective from the Jewish community, or for us to participate in an interfaith response, there's nobody else.
Yeah.
Right. So I learned that very quickly. Developed a quick friendship with Tammy Gieselman, who was the chaplain at UE at the time. And obviously, members of my congregation were a little bit up in arms and live in that area and brought everything to me, and so that was sort of the beginning. That was important, right? Because it was a great opportunity to meet people in the community,
Sure.
to see how the community functioned or didn't function at the interfaith level, to see the sensitivity of some, lack of sensitivity of others.
Sure.
So yeah, I do remember that.
And that sort of kind of kicked off what's been now over a decade of your interfaith involvement, and then specifically, like we were talking off camera, like if there's something that happens, whether it's interfaith or even international, if they need the Jewish perspective, they come to the rabbi to give that.
Correct.
But that's not this is definitely not your first rabbinate. Is that the right way to put it? What's the term I should use there?
So the rabbinate is sort of the profession.
Okay.
It's not my first pulpit. It's my
Pulpit,
third,
okay.
my third pulpit.
Okay. So I thought what would be fun, I know we've had bits and pieces of this conversation over the years of sort of telling our story to each other and then creating, friendship and life and camaraderie together over the last decade or so. But I thought it'd be fun to kind of go back to when you were a kid and talk about how your faith became important to you. And so, like, people watching, of course, are probably familiar with a bar mitzvah and, this actual rite of passage of becoming a man. So bring me back to, like, sometime in that era to where either you had your bar mitzvah or faith became a more meaningful part of your life.
I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, right? Southern Connecticut, about maybe an hour north of New York City. Fairly affluent area, big synagogue, pretty sizable Jewish community. I did all the sort of the normal things, went to religious school, had my bar mitzvah, which, I have some memories of. But it really was when I got into high school. I had attended, there were Jewish camps in the Reform movement regionally, one of them, in Massachusetts and in the Berkshires, and then got very active in our youth group at the synagogue. And those are my closest friends, actually, to this day.
Wow.
There are four of us who friends since, some of us since the third grade.
All guys?
All guys.
A group of guys, okay.
Through high school, involved in the synagogue youth group. We were part of a region that went into Westchester County. There were, events on the weekends that we could get out of the house and, leave our parents and hang out with our friends, all in the name of Judaism, which is great. And that led to more involvement, in the summer camps, and I was very active and one of the leaders sort of in the regional level.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. At what point did leadership start to become
pretty much in high school, right?
Yeah.
So I was, president of the youth group, and then, on the regional, board of our, of the youth group. And then, I was already beginning to think about potentially the rabbinate as a career at that point.
What other careers and things that were you considering at that point?
Well, the dream, right? The dream would have been to be
rock star.
Yeah, a rock.
I knew it.
if I were.
How'd your parents feel about that?
It's funny. So when I was in high school, I was, I had started piano when I was 5, did the recitals, did the whole thing, and then kind of rebelled and played with a couple of rock groups when I was in high school.
So it's their fault, right?
So,
they exposed you to this.
I was playing with guys who were well into their 20s, going into,
As a child? That's when you were, okay. Wow.
I was 15, 16, and I was the keyboardist, specifically as one band. Everybody was in their 20s. They were kind of sneaking me into bars in the weekends, and, I don't know how thrilled my parents were with that.
Right.
But that was sort of my happy place.
Okay.
But I also realized, I had a good musical knowledge. I wasn't good enough. That's the bottom line.
Even as a teenager, you had come to some sort of
because I saw people who were really, really gifted, and it was a passion. I was competent.
Sure.
But that wasn't. I didn't have the talent. So I thought about a lot of things. I think I knew I wanted a lot of education. I was always, pretty academically inclined. I wanted to, if I could, work in the Jewish community. I wanted to work, with people. I was drawn to the idea, of, teaching and counseling, and sort of the image of being a rabbi sort of allowed me to kind of do all that stuff. So I went to Brandeis University, large Jewish community, named after Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court in Waltham, Massachusetts. Really good academic school. Really loved what I was learning.
And at that point, the path was to become a rabbi, or what studies were involved in those first years? Yeah,
so I majored in anthropology because I figured, understanding humanity is probably key to understanding a lot of potential things. Minored in Jewish studies. By the time I was a junior, I was pretty clear I wanted to apply to the rabbinic school. So for us, they sort of identify you young, right? If you're involved in the youth region, if you go to a university like Brandeis, if you're involved at the college level, you're involved at the camp level. So I already knew the people at the seminary. Seminary is 5 additional years after your 4 years of college.
Wow.
You have to go to Israel for the first year, and then you finish up on one of the campuses. At the time, it was Cincinnati, New York, or Los Angeles. Now they're actually closing the Cincinnati campus because of lack of, people going into the rabbinate. That's a whole nother discussion. We don't even
have a flyover state represented in this?
No,
wow.
No, it's and that's a whole nother issue.
But you said they identified you earlier, or
The
like
admissions, the seminary, they have a sense, when I was at Brandeis, my graduating year, I graduated college in 85. So I think 84, 85, 86 coming out of Brandeis, probably are 25 Reform rabbis from that group. So we were all active in college, and it was sort of it was a path.
was your group of 4 friends involved in this part of the journey as well, or did any of those 4 guys also?
No.
Okay,
No.
okay.
We have,
so you're all into youth group kind of together, but you were an official leader in some capacity, and then of the 4 of you, you're the only one that made that sort of journey into an actual vocational.
Right. One is a CEO at an architectural firm.
Okay.
One is a pediatric pulmonologist, and one is essentially a spy. He'll tell you he's a civil servant working at the Pentagon.
Well, I want to go back to your college, but is just to keep on those guys for a second, is their faith still something that's important and meaningful in their lives? Okay,
absolutely.
Cool.
And what's interesting is sort of the intersection now, as we're all sort of older. I'm officiating at their kids' weddings,
sure,
which is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
right. Or they came to my kids' weddings, and we all went to each other's kids' bar and bat mitzvahs, and most of them are involved in synagogues in their communities still.
So you can play a special role in those ceremonial aspects of Jewish life. Awesome. All right, so now you're in university. Now you're in rabbinical school. Or tell me about Israel. That seems like that's quite the eye-opening, amazing cultural experience.
Most of us who went into the rabbinate had been to Israel prior, but we have to live there for a year.
Okay, so you'd already been.
So yeah, I had been, but short.
Sure, living there and visiting.
So living there for a year is something completely different. So, the main thrust is to understand, the people, the culture, the history, but also there's a lot of linguistics, right? Because we have to be able to become, fluent in biblical Hebrew, which is not a spoken language, but it's the language of our sacred texts. We have to be fluent in liturgical Hebrew, right? Which develops almost 2,000 years after the biblical Hebrew that you would find in our Torah scroll. Completely different vocabulary, grammar, syntax. It's obviously a more modern language.
Yeah.
Modern Hebrew, which doesn't really start until the late 1800s as a spoken.
It's almost three different versions of Hebrew.
Right, wow. Which is, the tenses of the verbs are completely reversed from biblical Hebrew. Obviously, there's a whole different vocabulary, and that's the language of the street, currently in Israel. We have to learn Aramaic, which is the language that, Jesus probably spoke when he was alive, which is a combination of Arabic and Hebrew, written in Hebrew with a lot of Arabic influences as well. Again, unique grammar, syntax, and the language of our Talmud and some of our liturgy. So we have all this linguistic focus as well as kind of walking in the biblical footsteps of our ancestors, learning the history, understanding the geopolitical situation from a hands-on perspective.
And this would have been in the mid to late 80s?
I started in 85.
Okay.
Yeah. I was ordained in 1990. So the 85, 86.
Okay. That was your
was
year.
When I was my year in Israel. Yeah. So funniest story, the year in Israel was, I'm a lifelong New England sports fan. Grew up in New England.
Oh, I know what happened in 86.
Yeah. So the Bears and Patriots are in the Super Bowl. And, I'm in Jerusalem. And this is before Al Gore invented the internet. So how do you watch the Super Bowl? So my buddy, classmate from Chicago, we have to go to Tel Aviv. We have to watch in a bar. They've got the time difference and the whole bit. And we have, the big bet on the big game. It's the first time the Patriots have been there.
Yeah.
We're in graduate school. We don't have any money. So we bet our beards on the Super Bowl.
You bet your beard? If the Patriots lose, you have to shave?
Right. And if the Bears lost, he was going to have to shave.
Oh, nice.
And the loser would have to present it at morning chapel the next day. So needless to say, the Patriots get trounced. And it was an unpleasant moment. Obviously, in the 35 years 40 years since, New England has long redeemed itself over Chicago in the football arena. But
well, it's funny because my brain immediately went to the baseball incident of '86. I don't know if you were in Israel for the Buckner.
We don't talk about that.
Or bring his name up. I mean, but all of those sins have been forgiven by this point with all the last 20 years of
my kids don't understand the pain of my childhood.
Right.
Growing up as
used to it.
New England sports fan, all they know are champions.
That's right. We just win. Somebody's going to win every couple of years.
Right.
All right. So you are getting plugged in. You're learning about it. You've committed. Is becoming a rabbi like? It's not like becoming a priest. You're not committing to celibacy. Are you committing on some sort of lifelong level? Like what are? Give me a sense of what you are having to commit to. You talked about the educational component, but can rabbis get fired? Can rabbis be? I don't even know what language to use. Lose their.
Be defrocked?
Defrocked, sure, something like that. Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Right?
Yeah, going back to your friends of you're all serious about it, but you make a special commitment, it seems.
Well, right, and the commitment is to education, right? We go to seminary, it's 5 years, right? You have to write a dissertation to be ordained in addition to the 5 years of education. And when we're ordained, right, we really get to decide how we're going to function and practice as a rabbi, right? Not all rabbis go into congregations. They train us for life in the congregational world, but some stay in academics. Again, the initial dissertation that we write sort of preps us. We can continue on it, in a university, we can go to a congregation, we can do organizational stuff. Some people do creative stuff. Some people just want the education and never practice.
And I understand the word rabbi is teacher. Is that still a fair approximation in English?
It is a fair approximation, but the role has changed. Certainly in Western society, where rabbi has taken on, the full functioning of clergy in sort of that Western societal sense, right?
But that just makes sense to me, I guess, just thinking about it that way. If there is this continued academic focus, it's like, well, that's what the role is.
We kind of we're always learning. It's sort of our nature, right? Most of us go on and get a doctorate of divinity along the way. So we've got, lots of degrees and quite possibly the worst degree to income ratio of just about any profession.
Sure. There are a lot of doctors making, or people with doctoral degrees making more money. Sure.
So, but it's definitely academically focused, and they focus on all the skills that we need in the seminary, but not everybody's cut out for the pulpit, right? It's being a congregational rabbi is very challenging. Now, when you're ordained, we become, as Reform rabbis, part of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. It's our organization, it's our professional organization.
Okay.
As long as we maintain our membership in good standing, when a job comes up, we can, email the folks in New York and say, hey, send my resume on there. But that's pretty much all they do, right?
And then it's up to you to interview.
It's a free market economy, right? So typically with a rabbinic job, it's a year-long process, right? Because rabbis, we look at a bunch of different congregations. Congregations look at a bunch of different rabbis. In the old days, it was a phone interview. Now it's, a Zoom interview.
Sure. Well, take us back to that. You're done with school. Like, how did you decide on, or how did your first, position come to be?
So
the interview and the whole thing.
I was when I was ordained, I was the rabbinic intern in Dayton, Ohio.
Okay.
Working with probably the greatest mentor in my career, Rabbi Irving Bloom. Irving fundraised and created a full-time position.
What was the age difference? You were 25?
I was 26 when I was ordained. He was, mid-50s at the time.
Okay.
Married?
Kids?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yep, he had grown kids. And
at this point, you're not married yet?
No, I am.
You are? Okay. So you're married, and I'm just getting a sense of who this guy is. See, that's a big
So he's
statement. The greatest mentor,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I mean, very much, sort of that father figure, mentor, great rabbi. Loved working with him. He created, the position so I could stay there.
So the relationship was what made that also attractive, because it was created because something is working here, so let's...
And then there was another rabbi who I knew from my camping experience, who was the rabbi at the most dynamic, fastest growing congregation in southern New Jersey. Dayton was a slowly dying congregation.
Sure.
The New Jersey congregation outside of Philadelphia was about ready to explode. So the potential for what I could do seemed far greater in New Jersey. And as I often say, I'm a pretty good judge of character with one glaring exception. And that was the exception.
This moment.
This moment in
you
time.
had this choice, and
I was offered both positions. I went to New Jersey. And, 4 years in, I mean, he was a dynamic, charismatic leader.
What was the age difference there?
He was, he just died. He was 82. I'm 61, so 20 years. Okay. So he's mid-40s.
Mid-40s, okay.
He's mid-40s at the time.
Married and
married
kids
with younger kids and
still somebody who you could you're knowing that you're not just getting into congregation, you are submitting to someone's expertise and mentorship and leadership.
The first job for us generally is not about location, but is about the individual that we're going to work with and for. Yeah. And that's the first job. And the typical pattern is you're an assistant at a larger congregation for 3, 4, 5 years, and then you either become the associate at another large congregation or you kind of go out on your own.
Okay.
Right? So I'm the assistant at this big place, and then we move into a new building. The congregation explodes. I'm promoted to the associate after my 3rd year. And then my 4th year in, his wife is tragically murdered. And 6 months later, his indiscretions in the congregation become public knowledge. The fact that he's the primary suspect in the murder comes to light. He resigns in disgrace, and they turn to me to lead the congregation. So I become
And you're 30? Not quite.
31. Okay. 30, 31.
Kids at this point?
Yep.
Okay.
2, third one was born in the midst of this.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
So I become the youngest senior rabbi of the largest category of congregation. Technically, I wasn't even eligible for that job for another 6 or 7 years. Sort of lead the congregation through this horrible crisis. A lot of people left. We were sort of the pariah of the community. A lot of repair needed to be done. They promote me to senior rabbi. I have to now hire an assistant. So I'm going to the seminary with all these rabbis in their 40s, 50s, and 60s looking to hire rabbis. And I'm in the elevator, because your first job, people go to the campus and interview all the candidates, and then we have sort of a matching thing. That's how the first job kind of works. So all these colleagues are like giving me their cards, saying, "Hey, I hope I get to see you later." And I'm
They're
kind of
schmoozing the young
I'm
guy.
I'm doing the same thing you're doing, folks.
Yeah.
So my criteria was to find somebody who looked younger than me, who could be a good partner, and I hired a great guy. And we really I was technically the senior, but we were really co-rabbis, 2 young guys, and the cantor leading the congregation through this awful stuff. We get the congregation to the other side. They're healthy, they're strong. And then both of us kind of decided at the same time it was time to move on.
Yeah.
Because I was always associated with him. And,
Sure.
For people, they would look at me and still, it was a constant reminder of what happened. So the final act of healing, I really think for them was for me to leave.
Wow.
So
Can I just linger on that part a little bit? And we can, like, there have been documentaries made about this situation, or at least, Dateline, stories and whatnot, so we can like link to that if people are interested in those details. But Do you mind like sharing like some of like the spiritual, like the toll that took on you spiritually, having to grapple with this, and you know, in any sort of tragedy, it's like, you know, where is God in a situation like this?
Yeah, I had to give a lot of those sermons, right? Because a lot of people in tragedy go to, you know, well, where is God? I think this might tie into other things that we want to talk about,
Sure.
right? I think people very quickly look to dismiss God from situations because it gives them an exit strategy from organized religion. And it's, to me, it's almost a pediatric understanding of God, you know, to think that God is, you know, so concerned with our lives that God makes everything good for us and for our communities.
Pulling the strings on everything
Right,
that might making the Patriots win the Super Bowl.
Right. So as opposed to, you know, the wrestling with God, which is a very Jewish thing. Actually, we're reading about it tomorrow in the Torah portion where Jacob wrestles with the angel, but it's really a metaphor for wrestling with ourselves, wrestling with God, wrestling with the decisions that we make in our lives, you know, and finding strength in our faith for us to carry forward and live life the right way.
Through the wrestling. Right. I don't know if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. That is his new book too, The Wrestling with God. He's very much on that same sort of.
You know, Elie Wiesel wrote a lot about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And you know, his experiences coming out of the Holocaust, wrestling with God for his whole life. That's a very distinctly Jewish thing. You know, every story in the Bible, somebody's wrestling with God at some point, and wrestling with themselves, and wrestling with their faith.
And were you personal? I mean, it's like I can imagine how challenging that would have been. I mean, you're talking about your age, you're talking about the size. It's like there's a reason why they don't have folks at a certain age in charge of that many people, and adding to it the tragic part, like just being able to
it took a
perform.
Huge, right. So it took a huge toll personally, professionally. I had to kind of reach and find mentors. So we have, like many religious traditions, we have sort of interim rabbis who sort of come for a year when there's been difficulty or crisis and help a community heal. You know, we hired an interim, but they moved him into my office and moved me into the senior office. But his main goal was to kind of help the staff through the difficulty. And I reached out to the rabbi.
Crisis counselor.
Right,
kind
exactly.
Of thing. Yeah, okay.
I also had to, you know, there was some sort of trauma therapy that I had to go through, right? Because I was the first person on scene, you know, apart from the emergency workers, when the rabbi's wife was killed, you know, and there are prayers that we say when someone dies. I was in the house. I saw the murder scene. It was kind of awful. So I needed a little help kind of moving beyond those images. It was years before I could watch sort of one of those criminal or murder shows on TV because I kind of lived it, right? It was.
And he was maintaining innocence in this time and needing and accepting comfort from you in ways that
but
you
also
would have to reprocess.
But I also
later.
learned later manipulating me,
preparing
me for what would be the inevitable, which was the trial, putting me in difficult situations, revealing information that supposedly was said in confidence to sort of show sincerity when it was exactly the opposite. Yeah, there was a lot going on. I mean, you know, I testified in first trial was a mistrial. These were the days of court TV. I was on the stand for an entire day at 2 separate trials. I was, you know, one day I was testifying the same day as one of the Philadelphia mob bosses, which is a whole nother piece of the puzzle that we don't need to go into. I was followed. My phones were tapped soon after, you know, the murder because they felt that I probably knew information or something. I mean, it was a surreal, the whole thing was just.
I feel like if anybody had deserved a sabbatical of some sort or some sort of retreat at this point, it would have been you, sort of near the ending of this. Like,
so
how did you?
So our placement director, again, they sort of just funnel your resume to places, but they can sort of speak on your behalf. Mm-hmm. So when the job on Cape Cod opened up, And I said to him, it's time to go. He said, where do you want to go? I said, I want to go there. He said, let's try to make that happen. And so moved there, lived on the Cape for a long time, raised our kids there. It was not a great congregation. Wasn't the right fit for me. I don't need to go into all the details, but it was the right place.
Did you know it early on, or like how?
Yeah, fairly early on. But, I couldn't, the interfaith work that I'm doing here just couldn't happen there. Just wasn't the community.
So it more than just the congregation, the fit in the congregation.
It was the community.
Also the community. Okay.
Right. But it was a beautiful place to live. Great place to raise the kids.
Sure.
kids
When your kids get to
memories,
that certain age,
kids have good memories. Their summers there. They're
in good schools and have good.
Yep. So,
how many years was that season then? The Cape Cod.
I was on the Cape for, I guess from 99 to 2013. 6 of those years in the congregation. Left the congregation, started a new educational center for a little bit, ran a Jewish school in Boston, had sort of a side
officially
gig.
Not a congregational rabbi during that.
During that time, right. But because I was committed to staying on the Cape for my kids to finish their school. I knew I still had a good chunk of my career ahead of me. Gloria and I were committed to moving, but only when our youngest kid finished high school. So Sarah finishes high school, going off to college. All the kids are gone. Nobody's coming back. We're left on an island, which for 6 months of the year is kind of isolating. And the other 6 months is overrun with tourists. So.
In your late 40s at this point? Mid to late 40s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Gloria and I, really for the first time in both of our lives, sort of take geography off the table and say the kids are gone. We got West Coast kids. We got East Coast kids. We can go anywhere. Let's find a community that fits us. So I'm interviewing all over the country. And I'd never honestly heard of Evansville, Indiana.
Oh, same for me.
So I called some of the previous rabbis who were here. I called, the contacts that I had in New York to find about the congregation, did some research, eyes wide open, skeptical as I was of everywhere that I was looking, looking at places in California, but the cost of living there is prohibitive, and trying to find the right fit. So interviewed at some places that definitely were not the right fit. One place near where my family lived that was in Westchester County, I think they were certainly ready to extend an offer, and I had just not a positive, from my perspective, interview experience. Came here, they kind of rolled out the red carpet, did the process right, very impressed, but more it was about the people and about the potential. This was a congregation that in many ways had had sort of a revolving door of rabbis for 40 years or more.
Yeah. What kind of term lengths are you talking about? That 2, 3, 4, 5 years,
maybe a couple longer, but, in and out for a lot of reasons. But they were looking for some long-term stability. And sort of the mandate was, let's kind of start from scratch, sort of like blow everything up and be creative and start over, which was very exciting. Most places you don't have that opportunity.
And was this also your first congregation that you would have had since the one in the, so you were in the Cape Cod congregation and then did some educational things for a while. Were there any other congregational rabbinate roles? So
one of the education center we started on the Cape kind of grew into a small congregation, but it was very small.
Okay. So this is, I guess I'm asking, is this kind of a return?
This is a return, yeah. This is a return to sort of where my heart was, at the right time of my life, right? So everything went well. People reached out to Gloria. Gloria, loved the community. I think that when I was here for the final interview, they had arranged for me to meet with pretty much every segment of the congregation. So I met with the young families. I had, met with the legacy families. We have 5th and 6th generation families in this community that go way back. I met with the, school families. I met with the empty nesters. I met, so when it came time for the formal interview, we sat at the table and they said, well, you already met everybody. We kind of asked everything. So what do you need to know? And then it just, worked out. And, Gloria came out, loved it. And, our eyes were open, but we were at that stage of life, where you'll be soon, where the kids are out of the house. And we said, we can do anything for 2 or 3 years. And if it doesn't work, we'll do something else.
Sure.
And, given the history of the congregation, I had a 2-year contract that could be extended to 4.
Okay.
6 months in, they asked to do the extension, which was good. And then before the 4, we, signed another 6-year contract. And before that was done, we signed essentially a lifer retirement contract so that I'm here, until I stop, being a congregational rabbi. So it's worked out well for us. I've had the opportunity to do some creative things in the community. I have a really good relationship. I know everybody in the community, by now. We're not huge, but we're big enough. And
well, take us back then now to where we even started the conversation of where we met. So 2013, you arrive, you turn 50. We have this moment of interfaith cooperation that can happen. I don't even remember how long that hubbub lasted, maybe a month or so.
But it planted the seeds, right, for Tammy and I to start what was called, remember we called it the Evansville Executive Interfaith Partnership.
I think that sounds right.
That was the title. Because we needed a solid interfaith. There were Christian groups,
sure,
but no full interfaith group.
Yeah,
right.
Not to my knowledge.
So we started that, and then at the same time, Kevin Fleming of blessed memory, our friendship grew, and we realized that there were some opportunities, and we started One God, One Community, which initially was just the Islamic Center, First Presbyterian Church, and the synagogue. The initial understanding that the Abrahamic faiths, we all go back to the same place, we all spread from the same tradition, and the understanding that the thread that ties us together is so much greater than any practice that might be different that we observe, right? So,
and it was also this sort of proactive. It wasn't just, hey, let's wait for the next incident or something like that, and then demonstrate our unity coming together for a service or a message. It was.
Correct.
Let's actually bring our congregations together or members of the community even, and you guys did pulpit rotations and service,
right.
open
It was educational, it was open in our buildings, it was learning. We started easy, right? And it was, okay, so what are our major holidays? What are the major tenets of our faith? What's the architecture of our buildings? What's the calendrical year sort of look like? How do we deal with, life cycle events? What are our views on, life and death and afterlife and marriage and, all the, and then we got into some, more complicated issues.
Sure.
Right? Because the Catholic Church wanted in, right? They had not been sort of involved in interfaith issues before. It's actually a funny story that the previous bishop took Kevin, Muhammad, and I to lunch, of course, at Biaggi's, which was like a joke, right? Okay. The bishop, the rabbi, the priest, and the Islamic leader walk into Biaggi's and said, the Catholic Church needs to be more involved in interfaith issues. This is where we want to throw our weight. He wanted the cathedral, so Godfrey Mullins was the priest at the time at St. Benedict, to join in. And so he said, so we want to make this partnership. This was on a Friday. Monday, we find out that he's been promoted to the Archbishop of Indianapolis and was leaving. This was his final act before he left.
He knew that was in the works?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
So we had the Catholic Church now as part of it. So it opened up another opportunity.
Sure. And Evansville, for people who have not been here, is historically been, especially on the west side of town, a German Catholic community. A lot of the roots of this town.
Correct.
So that's a big deal.
So that was a big deal, and people loved the interaction. And then along the way, we invited Adrian Brooks and Memorial Baptist to join in. So we had that sort of functioning. Kevin and I started working with EVSC and trying to bring schools to have some interfaith dialogue. And, Signature School, Castle Middle School, Castle High School, Harrison High School. We've had McGarry School. We've had Park Plaza. We've gone to the Lincoln School. On and on and on. And then it was church groups coming in and coming out. Me speaking in lots of different places. Again, the whole philosophy behind all this is most bigotry, hatred, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia is based in ignorance. Yeah. So if we can open the doors to dialogue, and if we can take the time to understand each other, learn from each other, understand at our core, again, there's so much more that we have in common. Not be afraid of what's different, but learn about it. Embrace it. Celebrate each other's difference, but also celebrate the unity. Maybe, just maybe, we can eradicate some of the hatred and bigotry that's in the community. And so that's been a huge part of what I've done, and now it's become just a regular thing.
Yeah.
I mean, throughout the year, my congregation is used to having, whether it's school groups, church groups, and then creating new partnerships, right, that never existed, right? Mayor Terry gets elected. Adrian, who is my dear friend and her pastor, we sit down with her and we say, what our community really needs is a mayor's interfaith advisory council. She loves the idea. She's a very spiritual person. She loves the idea of surrounding herself with diversity for guidance, but also for some direction. We assemble a group around the table that's never been assembled in this city.
Yeah, it was a slightly different and broader,
much broader
group of congregations, but more representative.
More representative,
and
there have been changes in the community, right? So we have the pastor of Crossroads Church, which is really, who's become a good friend.
Well, you're talking about Phil, right?
Yeah.
He was the guy who recruited me to Evansville back in 1999. So. Yeah, we go way back. But historically, Crossroads had not been involved in those types of conversations.
So now, he's got a seat at the table.
Yeah.
The Church of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
Never involved.
Yeah.
Again, and personal, it's all about creating personal relationships first. And then they lead to these. So the leader of the Latter-day Saints is a runner. I see him on the path when the weather's nice every day. We start talking. Also, I will say, after the tragic events of October 7th, there were groups that reached out to us in support, and there were groups that sort of abandoned us. And we really kind of learned who we can turn to in crisis. And so some of those individuals around the table, as well. And so it's changed sort of the interfaith direction, but I think, the fact that we had an interfaith Thanksgiving service.
Yeah, you were telling me about this.
At the Church of Latter-day Saints as the host, with our African-American Baptist mayor as the keynote, with, Islamic, every denomination of Christian, representatives of the LGBTQ plus community, clergy, pastors, me. I mean, it's kind of
In
amazing.
Evansville, Indiana.
In Evansville, Indiana.
Yeah.
In Evansville, Indiana. And it was hundreds of people, an incredibly positive community building experience after what had been a very contentious and divisive election.
Sure.
At a time when the community and the country is so divided.
Yeah, this is just post
Two weeks post-election.
Yeah. 2024.
Yeah. And, so to me, all these are signs that positive things are happening in our community, and I get to be a part of them because I'm the only rabbi around. And because it is part of the mission of being certainly a Reform Jew to do all this work, that we get to be a part of affecting positive change for the community.
Well, and the other part that I thought would be neat to discuss is it's not just a matter of interfaith dialogue and conversation and sitting, as nice and as important as this is, but we've actually done some hands-on things with Habitat for Humanity.
So Judaism's, we're a religion of action, right? So we don't just talk about what we should do, but we have to live those values and do them, right? So everything from, on our holiest days of the year, which are 10 days apart, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Rosh Hashanah, everyone who comes to service gets a brown paper bag. And on that bag is a list of everything that United Care and Service needs as the weather gets colder. And we tell people next week, when we're not eating, when we're fasting, you fill that bag, not only with what you're not eating that day, but with everything that they need. We fill our foyer with bags. And then the following Sunday, our religious school families load up their minivans and SUVs, and we hand deliver everything. And then with the people who are residents at United Caring Services, working hand in hand, we deliver everything. And sometimes we get a tour of the facility. Sometimes people sign up then to, serve a meal or whatever. But it's not enough just to write a check. We have to do it, right?
Or even just show up and receive a message or something like that, or sing a song.
So it's now 8 or 9 years that I meet Sister Jane Michelle, who is a force of nature, who you have to have on your podcast at some point.
Oh, yeah. She's the major gifts officer for our local Habitat for Humanity affiliate, and has been just like you said, a force of nature.
She is an unbelievable human being.
Yeah.
And so we start talking, and she bounces off me the idea that Habitat was starting a pilot program in much larger cities to have interfaith advisory councils and bring in all of the faith communities. Originally at their core, it was a very Christian mission, trying to expand that and trying to establish these interfaith advisory committees. So she has a follow-up meeting, which I couldn't attend, in which I was elected president, which is how things work with her. And although I've tried to step away, you took a short stint.
You handed it off to me for a little while, but I handed that hot potato right back after my year was up.
So I'm still technically in that role. Yeah. I think we built 11 houses.
Yeah.
And we just 2 weekends ago, we had sort of the Interfaith Build Weekend, where we had, our particular day. So they opened it up on Sundays, which is easier for our community, but it was also open on Saturdays. But the Sunday, we had probably a dozen members of our congregation, but we had, Presbyterians, Catholics, Buddhists, Jews working together, to build a house. And we've done that together on a couple of occasions. And we also work with SAW, which builds ramps for people with disabilities. So we've built, a few ramps on homes. We are creating a connection with the Immigrant Refugee Center that's being built on Green River Road to do some volunteer work and to see how we can help be supportive to the local immigrant community. These are all consistent with our Jewish values.
Let's go into let's lean into that and go into a potentially I don't even know what a qualifier. Let's go into politics. How we talked a little bit or alluded a little bit of how politics have sort of played a role in how a response is sometimes needed. How have you had to juggle that with a congregation that may, spread across different and maybe even more polarizing, political lines in this community?
So we would be considered a purple congregation. Okay. And I think most congregations sort of in, the Bible Belt, the South or whatever, are probably in that ballpark, but still, pretty consistent with Jewish voting patterns.
Okay.
Right. There are people who certainly disagree. Now, granted, I was ordained and I practice as a Reform rabbi, which is the most progressive wing of the Jewish world and the vast majority of American Jews.
Okay.
So, we are the largest denomination in America, more Reform rabbis ordained than any other denomination. This synagogue goes back to the very beginning of Reform Judaism, right? Actually, Evansville, the Washington Avenue Temple, was congregation number one in the Reform movement in 1873 when the movement started.
Really?
Right. The head of Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Wise, came to Evansville, dedicated the building, then went to Cincinnati and established his own congregation. So we go back to the very beginning.
Not this building that we're in, but this congregation.
But the Reform congregation.
Yeah,
so 1980.
The year I was born.
I was a senior in high school, but that's okay. The Reform congregation, the Conservative congregation merge. This becomes, so Adath Israel joins with B'nai Israel, becomes congregation Adath B'nai Israel.
Okay.
But they've only had Reform rabbis since the merger. So Reform Judaism, by far the most progressive, the most socially active. If you look at voting patterns, traditionally 75 to 80% of Jews tend to align themselves with democratic politics. Why? Because our tradition, when you look at the values that I'm talking about, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, providing for, food security, welcoming the stranger, remembering that we were all immigrants, working towards equality, complete openness and welcoming to the LGBTQ plus community. These are all Reform Jewish values. Protecting reproductive rights for women. I mean, these all fall within, key values of being a progressive Jew in America, which tend to align ourselves more with democratic politics, but not always, right? And certainly I've got many members of this congregation, who will affiliate, with Republican politics. However, when I teach things, I teach them from the standpoint of Jewish tradition. So I can take a Jewish text from 3,000 years ago and show how even then that traditional Jewish text talks about the modern issue of reproductive rights, right? The Torah, the oldest document that we have, is very clear that nowhere in it does it say that life begins at conception. It's just not a Jewish value. So when I teach that, and I've had members of this congregation who hop on the bus and go to the, what they call the pro-life march in Washington, sure, which I call the anti-choice march in Washington, and, have to say, look, this is what Judaism says about this issue. You've adopted a fundamentalist Christian view of this particular issue. It's not a right or wrong, but that's the value. It's not a Jewish value.
How do they respond to that tension? Or how does that tension exist within?
It depends. Obviously, it depends on the individual.
Yeah.
Some people get very defensive, and some, write letters to the president of the congregation. Our rabbi's too much of a bleeding heart liberal. We have to, But I teach Jewish values, and if the Jewish values have to align with what are considered to be liberal or progressive values, that's the history of our faith, right? It's not pushing a political agenda. I will never endorse a candidate. I will be critical of policy, I don't care who the candidate is, that goes against the values that I consider to be values of our faith and tradition.
Well, we're recording this at the end of 2024 in that transitional moment of Trump has been elected. He will be inaugurated next month sometime. We have potentially 4 years of more political turmoil and folks figuring out sort of where they stand and how they behave. You just signed a contract for basically life, or not life, but till retirement. So this is going to be a part of the next, handful of years at least for you. Is there anything that you're doing differently, or now that you sort of know where the end is in terms of your congregational leadership, is there a way that you're looking to lead into that as you look at kind of retirement and leading the congregation, and now some of the unknowns when you started this year and started this whole contractual thing?
So I mean, some of the unknowns, this is a movie we've seen before, right? And again, in early 2017, right, soon after the inauguration, when there was the ban on people from predominantly Muslim countries, Tammy and I organized, and it started here. Yeah. We had a huge rally at University of Evansville. I focused on it from the congregation, that, we are a people, we're an immigrant population. The one commandment in Torah that's repeated 36 times is, welcome the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We know that. That's our history. The only reason Jews are in Evansville is because we were victims of pogroms in Europe and people had to move here. It's the story of Jewish history from day one. So we weren't going to tolerate, a proposed ban on people based on how they worship, because it was fear-mongering and it was hate and it was Islamophobia. And I took some heat from that too, right? Early on, when there were refugees from Syria, which is obviously very timely now, we had a campaign to send money to help resettle Syrian refugees. And, these are all issues that we're probably going to have to deal with again and be supportive of it. The way I've kind of handled it, obviously the majority of our community was probably disappointed, to say the least, after the election. So the weeks following, I think my sermons were more about, sort of comfort, resilience, hanging on to hope. And then they've sort of morphed into all the work that we had to do still needs to be done, probably more than ever. We roll up our sleeves. We continue doing what we do. There's work that needs to be done. There are people that need help. There are more people who are going to need help. Our values haven't changed. So just because leadership changes doesn't mean that we change our direction and our focus. If anything, we double down, to do more work. So I see that, in the future. We're just a year into the Mayor's Interfaith Council. I think that's going to grow and blossom and provide more opportunities in the future. There are other completely unrelated issues, right? We suffer, like every other religious community, from a generational lack of attendance and involvement in organized Jewish life. We're losing 2 generations. And that creates a lot of questions about our future. And reimagining, what is Jewish life supposed to be? Now, we were ahead of the curve. We were streaming services before the pandemic.
Okay.
So that was seamless for us. But this past year on the holidays, I had some services where I had fewer people here for the main services of the year than ever before. And then when I went online, I saw that 600-700 people, not just from this community, but from all over, were viewing our worship services. So we have a reach far beyond the walls of this building. We have to figure out how to leverage that more. We have to understand that, community is different. Again, I was in school before there was the internet. Community was physical groups of people coming together in one place. It's not the definition anymore. Understanding that we have to morph and we have to meet people where they are, not expect people to meet where I am. And the first step of that is trying to understand where people are. And we have young people who are sort of in a desert with regard to their spiritual connection. And, how do we meet them there? How do we figure out, how do we, try to get there? My goal has always been to leave a congregation better than I found it, right? I definitely think that this community is in a better place than when I found it in 2013, but, can't stop. There's more that needs to be done. We need to grow, it's not just about numbers, but it's about engagement.
That's the word that's like coming up for me, and you just brought it up as well, is like a spirit or a spiritedness, or like responding to a dispiritedness maybe after the election from some folks in your congregation. And you had mentioned to me yesterday even about interest from maybe unexpected or unique places of people wrestling with God, wrestling with Judaism, and so talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of engaging them in a spirit.
Our biggest source of growth, obviously some people move to the community through the hospitals or one of the bigger industries or whatever, but our biggest consistent source of growth are people sort of wrestling with their religious and spiritual identity and becoming Jews by choice. That's what we.
These aren't people that have a Jewish, foundation.
This is a conversion to the faith, right? We call them Jews by choice, which is a long process. We don't proselytize, right? We don't go knocking on doors. It used to be historically that if somebody would show up at the rabbi's office and say, I want to be Jewish, they would usher them out the door 3 times because they would think, why would somebody want to join, this group of people who has been persecuted, murdered, oppressed, either they're crazy or they're serious, we'll see. We don't do that anymore. But we believe, education is one of our, strong values. So there's a pretty lengthy course of Jewish study. People will enroll. Now they tend to go to one of the online courses that the Reform Movement offers because they can do a much better job than I can do. And it's a much broader, bigger group of people that they get to study with dedicated professionals, So they study, they meet with me continually, they keep a journal. I require them to come here, attend services, events. We talk about sort of the cycle of Jewish life. We talk about their own wrestling with God. We talk about their own sort of experimentation, religiously, what's working, what isn't working. We deal with, family issues. What does your family think about you potentially exploring this? Some people, if they came from, let's say, a particular faith that would give them sort of an afterlife guarantee, if there was adherence, they're coming into a faith where that doesn't exist. And
that's a little bit of an adjustment.
So, how do you, what does that mean? How do you handle that? How do we deal with that?
Have you, I think I know the answer to this, but have you already seen that recent Netflix show, Nobody Wants This?
Watched them all.
Yeah. So that, and it captured, it may be the most popular series on Netflix, this year. And it's telling bits of this story of.
Right. So there were definitely some inconsistencies.
I'm sure stating it, but I feel like a lot of people that I know watched it. I definitely watched it. The Nobody Wants This. We got the young Jewish rabbi and his romantic interest, who I think is an atheist or just has no faith, maybe not even going to call herself an atheist, and how they navigate this connection together, knowing what it means to be a rabbi's wife, or even just what it means if he decides to not pursue that, to be, connected with somebody where his faith is so important to who he is, and not to her, at least at this time? And does she go on and get the education and fall in love with this faith that he is also in love with? And it captivated people.
It did captivate. Now, as you can imagine, the rabbinic community was highly critical, right? For a couple of reasons.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
One, the synagogue that the rabbi was working in very clearly looked like a conservative synagogue. It was more traditional, right?
Just by the architecture, or what would
you could just by everything from the dress from people attending services to the number of people at services, Fridays, Saturdays, the programming that was offered, the characters of the senior rabbi and the members of the congregation. Seemed like it was a conservative, not a reform congregation.
Okay.
So the problem with that is conservative rabbis are prohibited from officiating at an interfaith marriage, let alone being involved in
having one
an
themselves.
Interfaith relationship.
Wow.
And it was only last year that the Reform Seminary removed the qualification that said that you couldn't be involved with somebody who wasn't Jewish. You couldn't be married to somebody who wasn't Jewish and attend the seminary.
In 2023?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was just
wow.
from
And that's in the reform. That's in the most liberal kind of wing.
Right.
Okay.
So obviously the bigger issue is a really pertinent issue, right? 75% of American Jews are marrying outside the faith.
Wow.
It's a huge number, right? Reform rabbis, when I was ordained a long time ago, in my ordination class, there were maybe 2 rabbis who would officiate at an interfaith marriage. And it was, they can't prohibit us from doing things, but it was strongly, sort of condemn the practice because it was viewed back then that you were participating in that which was destroying us as a people. Fast forward to today, the same group of people, I think maybe there's one person who doesn't officiate at an interfaith marriage.
Well, what would you attribute that to? What?
The practical reality, right? If the shift in perception from, this is destroying us to the understanding that this is where people are at, so let's do everything we can to be open and welcoming so that hopefully they'll come and raise a Jewish family. So it's a paradigm shift, right? So, and I've done that in my own rabbinic world. If I didn't officiate at interfaith relationships, interfaith marriages, I wouldn't do weddings.
You wouldn't be doing weddings. Wow.
So that's one inconsistency sort of with the show, right? So you have, this sort of conservative leaning rabbi in this interfaith relationship. That would be a real challenge. But I think it brought up sort of that bigger issue that we're living in a world where religion is no longer a barrier to relationships. And if it's not a barrier, then, it's going to create these opportunities sort of for dialogue. And, he definitely, I don't think he wrestles Adam Brody, is that his name?
Sounds right, yeah.
His character, I don't think he's wrestling with his faith, but he's wrestling with sort of that outward perception and requirements of his role. And those are real issues, right? Those are real issues. The Reform movement was the first progressive religious movement of any religion to ordain openly gay and lesbian rabbis. We have dedicated liturgy to performing same-sex marriages from before the time that it was legal, when they were called commitment ceremonies or civil unions or whatever. Again,
well, even women being ordained, how that feels like that was something that was also
60 years in our tradition, right? So it goes back, quite a way, and now more than half of rabbis being ordained are women.
Really?
So if you look at today's, the people who are drawn into the rabbinate today, and this is one of the challenges that congregations are dealing with, right? In a given class, they're going to be men, single, married, gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, women, again, all the same. And, people coming into the program, transgender rabbis ordained, and, congregations get all these resumes, and not every congregation as an entity is open, welcoming, and accepting, And so, it creates a little bit of tension, because just because you're ordained doesn't mean you're going to get hired. And just because the philosophical position of the movement is one of complete openness and inclusion, it doesn't mean that congregations, certainly congregations in different parts of the country, are going to necessarily be open to hiring this particular rabbi. But, the numbers are way down. We don't have enough people to replace the rabbis who are retiring. It's creating its own crisis in our movement. And it's forcing communities to kind of reevaluate and change. So the TV show, I think, brings a lot of those issues sort of to the forefront, and it's created some interesting dialogue, in congregations.
And it's been renewed for another run at it. So, so maybe there'll be more to come in 2025 as well.
Who knows where it's going to go?
Well, I think we can start to wrap up here and look forward to 2025, because I had shared with you that this year in 2024, for whatever reason, I decided to give up atheism for Lent, and found out about that as a concept. And I've had, you've kind of walked with me at different times in this last decade or so of like what that means for me to identify as an atheist or an agnostic or as a humanist, and kind of landed on humanist as sort of maybe the best expression for me to sort of self-identify and see your humanity in the way that it comes through from what I project onto you is Gary's a good human, comes from a Jewish background, Jewish tradition, but I see the humanity. Same with Muhammad, Kevin, Jane Michelle, all of our interfaith friends. And then I go through this process of giving up atheism for Lent, and am brought back to kind of reckon with some of my faith tradition and how I understood God, and doing things like praying and fasting and allowing a mystery to be bigger than me and have influence on me in a way that I hadn't in a long time. And I'm planning on doing it again in 2025. And so I think it might be fun to explore some way for us to re-engage. I'd say if there's like sort of a roller coaster of Zach's on a spiritual high and he's connected with God, there is a God, and Zach's at a low, he's an atheist, there is no God. I'm probably somewhere here at the bottom half of that roller coaster of, man, I don't know. I don't know right now. The leaves are dying, it's winter, that could have something to do with it. But when February, March, Lenten season comes around again, I want to give this a try, and maybe we can get together with some of our interfaith friends
and
explore this further.
I think it's a great idea. And I think you should read some of the books by, his name was Baruch Spinoza.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So he was a religious naturalist, right? So his whole definition and understanding of his theology goes exactly to what you're saying. The fact that the leaves are dying, but then they're going to blossom again.
Yeah.
The fact that when you walk into, a forest of the same, you go to the redwoods or you go to a giant forest.
Just in Colombia.
So the trees are almost equally spaced one from the other. They grow to the same height. They have the same cycle of how they live their lives. To him, the flow of nature, the rhythm of time, that's what speaks to him about God in the world. That, he would say that stuff doesn't just happen. That's his argument for, a designer in the world. So he finds God through nature and in nature sees his connection to that which is bigger than himself. Now, he was ridiculed by some of his peers at the time. But, one of the beauties of our faith is there is no one understanding of God. Mm-hmm. We don't have an individual theology. And we don't have, a litmus test that you need to believe this to be considered Jewish, right? We have a multiplicity sort of options, and people's theologies are all over the place. And lots of religions have that. So I think that maybe for you, the key during your Lenten time is just to be open. Leave all the preconceived notions at the door. Just let yourself be. Go visit, houses of worship. But it's not just at houses of worship. You can find spiritual moments. You could find them through musical programs. You could find them out in nature. You could find them, at gatherings of like-minded people, who are simply being open and honest with one another. They all give you opportunities to get in touch with something outside of yourself. And that might be where, you begin to sort of explore the possibilities that something's there.
Yeah, and that is the definite downside to the folks who are spiritual but not religious, which is you don't necessarily have a community, a congregation to worship with and to belong to. And I don't want to promote people all creating their own bespoke religions. And so I think there could be some more for us to unpack there in terms of Judaism being a faith that you can understand and develop with yourself and your unique experiences and understandings of how God shows up for you.
Yeah, and also I think we do a bad job of marketing, right? In the world of religion, there are people that knock on the doors, sign people up, bring people in. We've never been about that in the Jewish community. And one of our, I think, fundamental principles is what's right for me, it's right for me. I would never say what's right for me is what's right for you. And I would never say what's right for you is incorrect, right? I think in that way, Judaism and Buddhism have a lot in common, right? The Dalai Lama, when he talks about truth, he talks about his truth being his truth, but other truths being equally valid, and the desire to understand, appreciate where people are and what their truth is, without ever trying to convince them that his truth should be their truth. And I think that's a lesson for all of us.
The Francis of Assisi quote that I return to all the time is preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. And that feels like a great mantra to try and live by. So, all right. Well, hey, thanks for doing this. Let's close with a hug.
Thanks, Zach.
That was great.
Who the hell is that?
It's not us.
It's not?
No.
Well, you have to admit, you guys are a weird pair.